M. The Media Project. Driven by data. Driven by technology. Driven by community development. Driven by the need to get results for your project. SM Graves Associates. Delivering real estate development to you, including project management and pre-development services with a keen focus on delivering community-oriented projects. We build profitable projects that respond to the needs of your neighborhood. Join the SMG family. Find us at smgravesassociates.com.
Here we are again, ladies and gentlemen. Your host, Scott M. Graves, here with you for another subject within the housing crisis in the United States today. And this is so important, a topic that we're going to be sharing this discussion on both SMG's Are We Here Yet podcast and our latest podcast, new podcast called The Housers Podcast. With me here in the virtual studio is my good buddy, Stephen Box, to talk about Stephen's most recent article in the Mountain Times here in Killington, Vermont, entitled Market Rate Housing is the Affordable Housing Solution. Stephen Box, welcome first off, and tell us in your words why market rate housing, the proliferation of more market rate housing, is in fact the affordable housing solution for our times.
Hey, Scott. Good to be here on a Monday evening with you, chatting about housing. So, I think it's sometimes the simplest solution is the best solution, but sometimes the obvious isn't quite so obvious. And in this particular case, we're mired, if you will, in a housing crisis where everyone's talking about affordable housing as if more affordable housing would solve the problem. And I think here the important thing is we got to identify the problem. I kind of lost my track of thought already. That's pretty fast, huh?
That's pretty
Usually
fast.
It takes me a few minutes.
It is Monday. But you know what? You and I are so immersed in housing in all its forms. Our knowledge is so
Scott,
you got to pull it back out.
Here's the deal. My wife is born in Hungary, and she spent her teen years in Munich. And 1/3 of her family lives in Hungary, 1/3 lives in Germany, and 1/3 lives in Canada, the branch that left Europe with the 56 revolution. Anyway. They left to Canada. So we have rallies all over the world. So from that perspective, I have some, and I'm Australian, so my rallies are in Australia. So from that perspective, I've got family members in 4 housing markets outside of the United States of America. And at the end of the day, housing's pretty simple. There's walls, there's a roof, and there's a floor, and somebody owns it or pays for it. And building materials are pretty common. We like to use wood and nails and cement and tin, and there's plumbing and electricity and, but housing's housing at the end of the day. Why is Toronto different than Munich, different than London, different than Sydney? And what was most interesting to me is when we were in Munich, staying with my wife's sister and her husband, they don't own their home.
Vast majority of Germans don't own their home.
Yes, that's crazy. I thought to myself, why would they not own their homes? They're upper middle class, and the irony is they own investment property. They just don't own their home. And it turns out there's no really benefit to owning the home in Germany relative to the United States. In the United States, it's incentivized in many different ways. But at the end of the day, why is I was looking up a musician the other day, Rafferty, Jerry Rafferty.
Yeah, sure.
I was reading his bio, and it was interesting because he said he was born in council housing. So in England, it's called council housing. It's been around for 125 years. It's government housing. That's pretty, the government's been pretty, what's the word, productive in terms of building housing. But then so has Germany, since the war, in terms of rebuilding Munich and building housing. So why is why is the excuse me why is the communist housing in Budapest, where my wife's godmother lives and owns her apartment, and my wife, grew up in when she was young in Budapest in the former communist housing, and then it was all privatized. Why is the market so completely different? And I don't think anybody's ever examined that. We just keep repeating this mythology of we need more affordable housing. And I think that it's a fair question. Well, which of these different models, whether it's the Canadian model or Sydney, Australia, or Munich or London, which of these works? And then if you want to bring it closer, London, Chicago, LA, which of these models works? And we know in Chicago it didn't work. The affordable housing, Cabrini Greens, they demoed them. We know that South LA, the projects don't work.
We know in New York and in Boston, it also largely hasn't worked.
So,
but the basis for that model that you describe in a place like Germany, particularly Germany, but strongly so the UK as well, or even in Hungary, right? The basis for which goes back to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And by the way, a basis that was studied in the early 1930s by, her name escapes me, but by a female, one of the earliest generation of urban planners from the United States, back when the discipline was just sort of becoming a discipline, was studied. And during the American, Great Depression, here in the United States, encouraged, hey, we should do housing the way they do it, over there, over in Austria, over in Germany, etc. But one of its main differences is, of course, that your house, the house you live in, is not seen as strictly as a commodity, an investment, something that in our post-World War II particular economy, the priority is on creating value, increase in value, and doing everything you can to make that as perpetually upward as possible, right? It can never go down.
Right.
And add policy on top of policy in order that can somehow artificially happen.
Mm-hmm.
Which has created it's not the only input that's created the housing crisis, but it's a part of it. It's the financialization of everything. And it's created a very unresilient, very fragile economic system locally.
I lost you there. I'm sure it was very profound, but I lost you. One thing to consider is this: my wife's godmother has no intention of moving. Therefore, the increase in property values means absolutely nothing. One of the differences is in countries that are transient, like the United States of America, versus countries that are hyper stable, where you've got 3 generations living in the same 2 or 3 square block area and have no intention of ever moving. Therefore, property values are zero consequence, as opposed to Californians that can't wait to buy, double down, and to keep churning, if you will, the increase in equity. Anyway, without getting off track, I didn't even start on the track, so therefore I can't get off the track.
I first need you to define in your words. The article is entitled "Market Rate Housing is the Affordable Housing Solution," right? So I just need you, as few words as possible, to just first tell us, and then you can explain. First, tell us why market rate housing is the affordable housing solution.
I believe there's 2 approaches to increasing affordable housing: the amount of available affordable housing. And there's 2 ways. The first one is to build more affordable housing. And at the end of the day, you've built more affordable housing. and you now have more available units for a specific demographic. On the other hand, if you took the same amount of lumber, the same amount of cement, the same amount of electrical, plumbing, the same amount of building materials, and built market rate units, the same number of units, because keep in mind, at the end of the day, the wood is the wood, the paint is the paint. If you built market rate units, priced them accordingly, you would end up with the same number of units. And what would happen is folks that are currently living in affordable housing but can afford more would move from the affordable housing that they're occupying, which frees it up, and they'd move into the market rate housing. What this would do is it would be attractive to the doctors, nurses, police officers, teachers, plumbers, electricians, the trades. It would be attractive to the professionals that the local community that you and I are hailing from, the state in general, is trying to attract, because there'd be a place for them to settle,
Right.
to land, and to be comfortable. And I happen to house professionals that are coming to town, and one of the decisions, one of the factors in their decision on whether to stay or go is not just am I digging the job, but am I also digging the living, my accommodations. Do I live in a walkable community, or do I live in a nice large lot community with a pond and a couple of acres? Whatever it is they're looking for, does it exist? And if the answer is no, they end up staying in some affordable housing because that's all they could find.
I've had the similar experience over the last decade in developing business accelerator programming, that if it has nothing to do with the accelerator itself, if the accelerator takes place in a given territory, if these new professional class young entrepreneurs can't find a place to live in that territory, guess what? They'll participate gladly in your accelerator, and then they will leave when it's over. Or maybe they never got there in the first place because they did it remote meeting style, simply because it has nothing to do with the business side of things. It has to do with, I couldn't find a place to live that is the right kind of housing for me.
So if you build affordable housing, you'll house folks that are making whatever the percentage of the average median income, whatever the formula is. And by the way, affordable housing, can be taken two ways. One is that if you build the affordable housing, you'll have more housing for folks that are making X percentage of the local, the area median income. And at this point, we should clarify the term affordable housing is kind of it's applied, but there's two basic applications. The first one is that the apartments are priced at a certain point, rent. And for example, the what was the community that just voted down their affordable housing project?
Here in Vermont, or in another state? Here in Vermont, or in a neighboring state?
Here in Vermont, a community up north just voted down an affordable housing at the city hall.
That's Greensboro, right?
Okay, in Greensboro, that project was designed not to be subsidized housing, but to be housing where by covenant the rents would be controlled, if you will, or kept at an affordable rate. And the second type of affordable housing is housing where it's subsidized. And there's two kinds of subsidies. There's one where the person has a voucher, and there's one where the property gets the voucher. And so Vermont State Housing Authority, for example, which is the oldest housing authority in the United States of America, they have many different iterations of subsidies. But at the end of the day, they set the rates then. They set the rates every year as a function of that agency.
Which are
so those are two different.
The uninitiated, right? Our listeners are set by a percentage, a range of percentage of income, and the income basis is what they call AMI, or regional area median.
Again, I couldn't hear what you said, but to clarify, on the first one, the tenant is paying the entire rent, whatever it's set at. It's just set at an affordable rate. In the second scenario, the state sets the rate, or the housing authority, because Rutland Housing Authority uses different numbers than Vermont State Housing Authority. But at the end of the day, they establish the rate, and the tenant pays 30% of their income.
Right.
So if they get $1,000 a month from Social Security, they'll pay $300, and the state will pay the difference. Okay, so if it's $1,000 rent, the state will pay $700, and the subsidized party will pay $300. In either case, the landlord is limited on what they can charge and is at the mercy of either the covenant or the housing authority that sets the rates every year. The covenant, I don't know what they could put in the covenant how much it can increase each year, and there might be a cost of living increase in the covenant. Anyway, at the end of the day, if you build affordable housing, you'll end up with more affordable housing, and you'll end up housing more people that need affordable housing, which means they're lower income. On the other hand, if you were to, by the way, if you require developers to set aside and as a condition of the development, as you mentioned in the project you were talking about a little bit earlier, it was going to be 20%. If you require developers to set aside 20% of the units that they're building in a development or a project as affordable units, you're going to discourage development. And keep in mind, your objective was to build more affordable housing.
Right.
And the irony is,
and the reason for that, again, for the uninitiated among our listeners who are also very interested, though uninitiated, because simply put, that doesn't necessarily get those programs that encourage us as developers to do so. They don't always dollar for dollar match that cost. What I'm saying is it still costs what it costs per square foot to develop that property. But if you're telling me that I have to lower, the amount of rent or purchase price I can be guaranteed, some programs make up for that or make up a portion of it, or might not make it up at all, at least not in direct payment. And that can get tricky, right?
And see.
Yeah, there we go. Okay. So,
all right.
The study, by the way, and we'll have a link directly to it, the same one that you referenced there. It's Evan Mast published it from the what was it, the Upjohn Institute, I believe. Yeah, the Upjohn Institute. His research yielded that in building 100 new market rate units typically may lead unit leads 45 to 70 and 17 to 39 people to move out of below median and bottom quintile income tracts, respectively, right? So in other words, for every 100 new market rate units developed at market rate, in his research, that would lead to, for below median quintile, 45 to 70 units where people moved up. So the availability of better housing meant that people shifted, right? That could afford to move up. And your bottom quintile income tracts, this would be what's measured by the government as the lowest of the low income rated households, could then 17 to 39 of those households in those markets could move up. In other words, justifying what you're saying, which is, a strong portion of people, as inventory is loosened at market rate, people are able to, the less expensive units become available and people can move up into them.
Yep. So at the end of the day, the irony of encouraging affordable housing is you discourage development. And when you discourage development by requiring affordable housing to be an element, a component of developments, if that particular requirement is standard for all the developers that come to town, less developers come to town, not because they care, but because they can't. Right. A percentage of the developers won't be able to pencil out the projects because you've capped the rent on 20%, whatever The scenario that we were discussing before the show, it was a 20% scenario. But whatever it is, 10%, 5%, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, the project has to pencil out for the bank to put the money down, or private parties to put the money down. So no bank will put down the money and say, we're gonna finance at 100 and you're gonna return at 90. Let's do this all day long. That's losing money.
Right.
So you're excluding those people. The irony then to requiring affordable housing is you end up discouraging developers. On the other hand, if you encourage developers to build market rate housing, number one, it allows folks to move up out of the affordable housing, which opens up the affordable housing. The second thing is it just increases the housing market, which takes some of the pressure off, which means that prices can right price. In other words, you're going to end up with a positive impact. And by positive, what I mean is, if your objective is to encourage folks to live in the community, and you want their dollar to go the distance, then one of the big complaints is the prices are going too fast. And in this particular case, the fastest remedy for that is not to pull a Trudeau and try and control. In Toronto, my wife's cousin is a realtor, and so when we stayed with them, we ended up talking about Toronto real estate and
a tight market, one of the tightest.
Yeah, yes. And so if Trudeau was getting involved, I mean, that's just the absolute wrong approach. When one of the simplest approaches is increase the number of units that are available, whether it's affordable or market rate, and you'll end up with the market right pricing itself.
And we have a small example of that in the United States as of late. Coming out of COVID, Austin significantly reduced its restrictions through zoning and ordinance, and through 2023 and into 2024 increased its housing stock by 1,500 units, which for that market was significant, right? It went from 0 to 60 pretty quick. I will say one of the challenges to several, not one, but several developers that were producing all of that stock in such a short period of time. So let's first talk about the aggregate change, right? Almost overnight, rents in Austin went down some 7%, proving that if you can do a sudden and meaningful amount, whatever the ratio is different in every market, but a meaningful amount of units, right? Prices will fall in equal, meaningful, some ratio, right? But this, of course, was a problem for several of those developers, right? Because if overall, if you're basically running your project on low margins, right, that 7% might be all the difference in the world to being able to, finish them and cash flow enough to then, sell or refi or not. That having been said, I want to focus for a moment on what happened. 1,500 units came online within a year, which is fast in the United States. And the aggregate rents in that city, a very popular city to live in, went down some 7%, right? Inventory is the best and fastest way to adjust prices. And of course, it has the very meaningful effect of it's providing housing that people need. Right.
I think the interesting what's the word? Outcomes, benefits to market rate housing aren't just housing. Right now, there's a lot of discussion about the cost of healthcare. I don't know about right now. Healthcare has been a discussion for as long as I can remember. That being said, one of the complaints is that healthcare in Vermont is expensive because they're paying, I don't know what the factor is, but they're paying a lot to have traveling healthcare workers come to town. And I house travelers, and
this is participants in the Traveling Nurse Association.
Yeah, yes, nurses and doctors. So I have 2 doctors currently and 2 nurses. So I have 4 members of the traveling healthcare team. Um, so I work with different agencies that represent them. So in other words, to get that healthcare professional, um, to show up for work, there's often an agency behind them that's facilitating the traveler or the contract, and also paying for the housing. So it's quite expensive. My point here is build market rate housing and the cost of healthcare goes down. Period. End of story. Say no more. Because if we can staff our healthcare facilities with locals that own their home and are happy where they live and aren't going to be leaving, then it's going to be a lot cheaper, because all you're paying now is their salary and bennies, as opposed to all of the incentives to get people to come from other states to work in our healthcare facilities. Oh, by the way, and in terms of efficiencies, if traveling healthcare professionals come for 90-day contracts, how much of that 90 days is spent onboarding and learning the system? I've had folks that are a little frustrated by, they talk about their experiences at the local hospitals and healthcare facilities. And some of the things they talk about are their frustrations because they bring experiences from other facilities around. So it's interesting to pollinate. I think that's a benefit. On the other hand, if it's only a 90-day contract, how long is it going to take them to get up to running speed?
With fast-moving and sweeping changes to our economy in the works, we all need to reconsider how our investments are best placed. At Partners in Housing, we believe your money is best placed locally, utilized to increase value and provide stable and desirable housing to your neighbors. Contact Partners in Housing to find out how you can participate in local housing opportunities by joining the Partners in Housing Fund. Look us up at partnersinhousingvt.com or email us at partnersinhousingvt@gmail.com.
And so I've had 5 primary doctors here in our community since I've been here in the last 4 years, 5 in the last 4 years. So there's no continuity. So, what does that do for the efficacy of the healthcare that's being provided? So you see, affordable housing will cause our healthcare to be more effective and cheaper. I mean, right there is the selling point. Oh, should we continue? Yes.
Well, I'll add some numbers. There's some real world numbers. So my numbers are a couple years old, but a project I was looking to do in the NEK about 4 years ago. The average nurse in the state of Vermont makes somewhere between $40 to $60 an hour. Traveling nurses are paid in upwards of $130 an hour. And they change over every 13 weeks, right? Which, these are little things, but sometimes they're not so little. I'm an ER nurse, and every 13 weeks, I change over. So the first couple of weeks I'm working in the ER, hey, how is this crash cart set up? Oh, this one's different than the last hospital. Like where's the EpiPen? Those kind of things, right? Which can have an effect on your customer experience when you go to the hospital. Yeah, it's extremely far more expensive to pay for traveling professional help than it is for them to live locally. You and I have talked about the gentrification side of this. I'm of the opinion that you can, that gentrification. We both have different opinions on gentrification, and both of them are correct. I'll put it that way. I'm of the opinion that, look, it has nothing to do with the housing part of that. If we couple an increase in inventory, an increase in overall value of a neighborhood's real estate property, if we couple that with economic development policy, in other words, access for the neighbor, for the existing population in the neighborhood, access to capital and access to better jobs, better job training, better entrepreneurship opportunities, which we can do largely through economic programming, then you're training people to stay in the neighborhood and pay the increase in rent, or to be able to afford to buy those homes, which now are going to increase that much faster in value for them, right? Making their lives more stable. That's my
Yeah.
yours. I know is different, but it's also correct, and I'll let you sort of explain the way you see things.
We live in an amazing time. But I know that there are folks that miss the days when everyone, uh, rode a horse and didn't have a car. But at the end of the day, all that nostalgia is quite honestly a load of horse crap. Because what we forget is when everyone was riding horses, people had to come out and shovel horse manure. And they had to have teams that would drag dead horses out of the street, because when they ran out of gas, they fell over, and you needed people to drag these dead animals.
They really ran out of gas.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, I spent Nancy and I spent the last 20 years living in Hollywood, and Hollywood is the epicenter of nostalgia, if you will. And there was a lot of anti-gentrification going on in a lot of the neighborhoods, as LA, just was developed. And at the end of the day, I think about great cities that have been rebuilt. Munich was rebuilt, but that's because it came out of the war.
Yeah.
Paris was rebuilt, literally. I mean, Paris is a city on top of a city on top of a city. And this is not uncommon.
It's the Republican city that we have now. And by the way, it's got to be the earliest example of quote unquote modern housing development, right? The basic footprint of the city,
But there was a guy that came along, a guy in charge of public works, who literally lifted the city and opened it up. It's the city of light, because he believed that light and air was essential for public health. And so there's a public health solution to gentrification, because at the end of the day, sometimes these cute little, by the way, I was just in Portugal, in Alfama, which is the equivalent of the Barrio Gothic in Barcelona, but it's cobblestones. There's no cars. The streets are the width of an alley. You know what I mean? It's not even wide enough to take a small car. They're windy. It built up over generations, hundreds of years.
Yep.
And at the end, it's awesome. It's super. It's a wonderful experience. But at the end of the day, it isn't you go to Iceland, you look at the development there, and you're thinking, oh my God, they're housing efficiently. It's healthy. It's so many things. At the end of the day, you can only be rustic and live in a camp for so long before you realize this isn't sustainable. And so with regards to gentrification, at the end of the day, what is it that people are protesting? We're going to improve the quality of life in this community. And yes, it's going to end up becoming market rate. And hopefully, we'll be able to tie this into the local economy so that the people are making more money. So that you're not eking out a living in a Alfama, in a neighborhood where there's little opportunity for to earn a living. Like,
Yeah,
what
right.
are you going to do?
We might even call that, because it's such a disconnected place. It's a ghetto. We're ghettoizing that neighborhood,
Barrio, it's the Barrio Gothic, it's the Gothic ghetto in Barcelona. Alfama was, it's the ghetto, and there's nothing. I mean, it certainly has a lot of personality and character and flavor, and I enjoyed my stay, but I was a tourist. I wasn't there working. And so at the end of the day, I think that gentrification isn't just raising, R-A-Z-I-N-G, the neighborhood, and then raising, R-A-I-S-I-N-G, a new neighborhood. It's also introducing a new economy,
right,
with opportunities to elevate, as opposed to just perpetuate the poverty that exists. I think that there's a lot to be said for the many different ways that we can address poverty. By the way, I also experienced rent control. I lived in rent control when I was in Hollywood. And so many of these well-meaning things like protecting, the anti-gentrification movement, the rent control movement, the, fill in the blank, uh, just cause eviction movement. So many of these movements are well-meaning. They sound great because they're great bumper stickers. But at the end of the day, they're flawed policies, because with rent control, what you ended up with is people couldn't afford to move. Because if you moved into a place where the rent went up 3% every year, within 5 years, you now can't move to the apartment next door,
Right.
because it has been increasing every time it turned over, and it turned over every 6 months while you were staying in your apartment. And so NC and I, we're in Hollywood for a good spell. And it's crazy, because when I found out what others were paying, it meant that we couldn't move to other, if we'd attempted to. We didn't. We moved out. But the point is, it is it's like indentured residency. You know what I mean? It's like you're kind of stuck. You're attached to it and can't afford to move out, because the universe has been changing while you were there comfortably resting in your affordable housing.
Right.
But at the end of the day, what if we'd wanted to move for a better job? Can't. What if we'd want to move for a better opportunity? Can't. Like, when you have people that are bound, even bound by an annual lease, which boggles me that the state and HUD require annual leases. And I've had folks say, I want to move in with my girlfriend. According to HUD and the state, they can't, because they're stuck in a 12-year lease, which is a condition of subsidy. So do you see, like, I think a lot of this, I know that the topic was gentrification, but at the end of the day, I think there's a lot to be said for, having a brutally honest conversation about, is this the best use of this community, this neighborhood? Could we do better? What could we do to bring in better transportation? By the way, Portugal, amazing transportation. And the funny thing is, it cuts through the Alfama. You can take a tram, a trolley, a bus, and a train. You don't even need a car. So there's so much going on. But if we come into some of these communities and say, we'd like to, do this to bring in some better transportation, we'd like to do this to bring in some better community benefit, like where's the park, where's the swimming pool, where are the facilities, where's the amphitheater, where are the gathering places, and we'd like to then consolidate some of the housing and move it over to here. And these are great ideas for improving the quality of life in a community. But folks sometimes are committed to perpetuating this nostalgic, oh my God, by the way, here in our neighborhood, everyone I talk to tells me where they grew up playing in our yard or the yard across the street, because apparently the house that we live in now was a popular house. And so a lot of the folks that are my age and older grew up on the street. Before all those trees were planted, that ruined that yard. They all have these stories on something so simple as how the trees ruined the neighborhood, because they used to play baseball in that. Now it's like, now you see all those trees, it blocks us from using that yard. And I think that sometimes we get a little attached to the past and then lose sight of the fact that there's an opportunity for us to attract investors, attract developers, attract a vision for improving the quality of life in our community and making the community attractive to the professionals that we need in the most agingest. I know everybody's aging at the same rate, whether it's my 5-year-old or me, but Vermont, I think, is lacking in the youthful demographic that it needs with regards to young professionals. And for that to change, we're going to have to gentrify some of the neighborhoods. I think you call it gentle density.
Well, that's right. That's a slightly more specific reference to increasing the number of units per acre and finding smart ways to do that while still staying as close to, if not within, all of your zoning and local ordinance restrictions, right? So, which can be done in a number of different ways. And but usually it can be made a slightly easier by updating some of those zoning requirements too. So,
do you know of any communities without zoning requirements?
Well, in our neck of the world, in our sort of corner of the world, absolutely not. Here in the Northeast, it's pretty widespread. Now, I know somebody somewhere listening would say, "Well, my community has no zoning," and that's true. There are some particularly very small communities that opted never to have restrictive zoning of any kind.
Mhm.
Um, that's neither here nor there. I think the more important thing to start any conversation with zoning off with is historically, it's a fact that zoning was never created for awesome planning on sort of on a positive side, which is to say, it was never created to tell people what they can do. It was fundamentally created in an age where it became very important to certain groups of people in the United States to tell people what they can't do, where they could not go, and what they couldn't do in those places if they were there. And so,
Mhm.
that peppers even when we look and say, well, but that zoning rule, that just makes sense, right? You don't want to build a power plant next to a bunch of houses. Well, that's true. Like, I don't think anybody would argue with that. But that's not fundamentally why we created zoning in the first place. I would even argue that in almost all places, you wouldn't get a power plant being built next to houses on purpose for the most part. You see, you might get them built next to a poor neighborhood because because that's what people do, right? But remember that zoning was frankly meant to exclude poor people from certain areas, right? And so one could just as easily say that with traditional zoning, that's how things like power plants or major polluting companies ended up becoming neighbors with poor people, right? Because those things are never built in wealthy neighborhoods; they're built in poor neighborhoods that cordoned off to those places.
I just just read an article about New Hampshire was attempting to or is making a move to take over local zoning
That's right. Yeah.
because local communities are actually using zoning to say things like you can't build on a lot smaller than 2 acres, which means that the only people that live in town are going to be living on 2 acre lots with a large house, which means you're not going to end up with a developer developing um, even market rate housing, but for a market that fits in that particular town. In other words, it's an exclusionary zoning.
Correct. It's what you don't get is multi-unit, multi-family housing,
Oh yeah.
which is exactly what they're trying to exclude. And deep down inside, that's a let's restrict people of relatively modest means compared to all of us that can't afford a large, like say, 4-bedroom single family home on 2.5 acres, right? Conversely, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts recently passed a bill, a TDI law, they call it, which requires some 77, 75, or 77 cities and towns by a certain date to pass local zoning changes within proximity to a commuter rail station or a MBTA rail station, allowing easing the restrictions on multi-unit housing around the transportation there. So encouraging density around public transportation options, uh,
Mm-hmm.
which which has largely been passed by all of those communities. There's still some yet to go that whose to date their deadlines have been extended. It did not come without some controversy, right? And there were a lot of places where it's unfortunate for the people who ended up on LinkedIn or other digital platforms with their rants going on, but it really, in stark terms, in a lot of cases, showed the difference during public comment period between the young and the old, the rich and the poor, right? Even to the extent where a few testimonials given by younger people said, my parents don't want this new, zoning regs to pass, but without it, we can't afford to stay in the town that we grew up in.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of says it all, doesn't it? It was okay for me to come here in more affordable times, but I'd like to close the door on those behind me, even if that means I'm closing it on my own children.
Yeah. You know, one thing we didn't talk about is employee-sponsored housing. Levittown, for example, is a controlled community, if you will. But there are, I don't know if you guys have, on the West Coast, Kaiser is the big insurance company, Kaiser Permanente.
Yep.
But Kaiser was originally a mining company, and it provided health care for its employees. And eventually it became Kaiser Permanente, one of the largest health insurers, on the West Coast. There are examples of the guy that did Pullman, the guy that did the Pullman railroad cars.
Yep. Rail cars. Yeah.
He had housing for his employees. And there was a time when large employers actually provided housing, which you might call the modern day affordable housing, because these weren't the folks on the top end of the these were for the laborers.
No, many auto manufacturers did this.
Yeah.
And if we go back to the 1890s in particular, but starting a little earlier than that, it almost became like a fad. There's throughout New England, as an example, there are examples of planned mill towns. Where I had ended my tenure owning my music merchandising company during COVID, we were developing a new property, a new site for the company in what they called Shawsheen Village, which was a planned industrial community.
Mm-hmm.
It was an entire village that had been built with, our business was going to be in what amounted to their spa. They called it the spa, which was their, sort of like community center, right? There are a number of different uses going on in the original building. But it was housing for upper, middle, and lower class. Everybody, middle management, upper management, and the workers in the textile mill that was built at the center of the planned village, right? And this went on for about a good 80 years in the United States, where you have industrialists experimenting with planned communities, right?
Yep. So currently, Costco, and I don't know, is Costco an East Coast thing?
Yeah.
You have Costco?
We have them here, yeah.
Okay. You know that in their profit, by the way, way off track, but you pay the membership fee. Apparently that's a significant chunk of their profit margin or profit portfolio. Like, they're not making money off the $1.50 hot dogs like they're making off the membership. The membership, I thought, was nominal, relative to
that's actually surprising. But I guess, conversely, let's look at it like they wouldn't be the first large corporation to make their money off of fees.
Yeah. I mean, banks
Right?
make them off. Banks, the largest source of revenue for banks is the overdraft fee.
That's right.
35 bucks here, 35 bucks there. Next thing you're talking about trillions of dollars. Costco is developing the space above their stores. How on earth we don't require Walmart to build straight up as a condition of coming to town. Instead, we say, here's my soul. Here's the future of our community. Here's the, here we're going to sacrifice the local merchants to the Walmart god, because we're so happy that you come to town and pay, next to, poverty wages. Like, it boggles me that we don't put, if we're, rather than putting the screws to developers to build affordable housing, why aren't we requiring Walmart to build straight up, however many floors it would take, to make it worthwhile to the community for the negative impact they have? Costco, which I think has a positive impact. In other words, if you look at the, by the way, Costco was taken to task by some investors because of the health insurance that they provided for their employees.
Right, and their CEO said, take a hike.
Because I know what I'm doing.
Right.
And so the employee loyalty is dramatic. The positive impact in the community is dramatic because they're paying a fair wage, and they're putting housing on top of their units. And this isn't anything new. Kaiser was doing housing and healthcare. There's a company in LA called Clifton's. It was a restaurant chain, and during the Depression, they had the pay what you can. And it's an amazing family run. But Clifford J. Clinton the head of this particular company, he found a local doctor and said, "I'll pay you. Here's $100. Can all my employees come see you?" And then on Sundays, they are allowed to go to his house to swim in his swimming pool up in Los Feliz. His house was around the corner from where we lived in Hollywood. And I just think that there's these great examples over time of where an employer did the right thing, whether it's letting him, his employees swim in the swimming pool at his house on Sundays, or whether it was actually building housing for them. And absolutely, yes, let's just go ahead and accept the fact that there's an argument where people have been oppressed, people have been charged for the housing in excess of what they were earning, so they became indentured servants.
Well, yeah, there were companies. They were relatively independent but highly successful company towns, and then there were, the mining communities in West Virginia. There was a spectrum depending on who stewarded those planned communities, right? So there's a little bonus for our listeners because it wasn't the main focus of our conversation tonight. But seriously, these are, whenever you and I talk, there's always a plethora of solutions, right? That our listeners can sort of take from.
Well,
so the article, ladies and gentlemen, that Stephen Box wrote, "Market rate housing is the affordable housing solution." We'll have links to it in last week's Mountain Times that was dated May 28th and 2025, and also links to the report that's referenced in the article. And then we'll have Stephen back talking about just some of these additional alternatives for housing development. It'd be interesting to tell the Walmart story, or just in general the story of why Stephen, communities, right, planning and economic development departments within communities large and small, how it is over the second half of the 20th century we got into the habit of poaching large employers like Walmart. Walmart really led the way, although they weren't the only large corporation to do it, led the way for this kind of like poaching large employers from other communities to come to your community and basically incentivizing them through freebies, right? And the consequences that's had on municipalities' capabilities to, manage revenue, raise revenue through organic tax growth, and it's had a profound effect on housing and restricting housing. So, without further ado, we'll close it up. Any other last thoughts?
No.
Well, folks, we're going to be able to hear this on the Are We Here Yet podcast and the Housers podcast this week. And this is your host, Scott M. Graves, saying good night and good luck. Little Edward R. Murrow for you.
Yeah, good night.
SMG's Are We Here Yet podcast is a production of M the Media Project and SM Graves Associates. Learn more at smgravesassociates.com.